Hi friends, in this video I'm just going to share some tips on stitching with colour changing thread. So that could be Coloris thread or variations thread or variegated thread. I'm using Coloris thread today, DMC Coloris thread. I always use DMC threads. This is 4520. A nice Christmas palette with the reds and the green and the white in there, and I think there's a bit of brown in there as well. In the Coloris threads there is usually 4 different colours that run through them, and then you can see on my needle here some rubbish attached to my needle that the changes happen gradually throughout the thread. I love Coloris threads. You can really see the different colours running through them, and you just get a nice vibrant colour change. So the first tip is thread with 2 strands. Don't use the loop method to start. And the reason for that is if you use the loop method, let me show you with another strand. When you fold your strand of thread in half, so if you had 1 strand and you folded it in half, your colours next to each other won't line up correctly, although this one almost is, but you can see here like the red and white is next to each other, which is actually another effect called tweeding, if I remember right, where you use 2 different coloured strands, but as you can see, like the colours aren't in sync as you're stitching. Now it can actually give it a pretty cool effect if you want to try it like that. I actually have these examples here that I've already stitched. So the top one I stitched just as I'm about to show you now, so the colour changes, you can really show them. And then this one was stitched with, I think this was loop method, or one of these was with the loop method. And can you see like all of the different colours running throughout them? So it does have a pretty nice effect on it. And I share more about these 4 differences on my blog over at hannahhandmakes.com. If you just search Coloris threads, the blog post will show up, and I just show you the let me brighten that up a little bit and you can see it better. I just show you like the differences with stitching with those ones. But for this video I'm going to show you just how to stitch with them to get the nice colour changing colours. So the first thing is make sure they're lined up at the top. You don't want one down here and one there with your strands of thread, because then again they won't be like synced up on either side. Now it doesn't have to be perfect, but just try and make sure that you do line them up as much as you can. Sometimes when you're threading your needle they can just become a little uneven, and then just fix that out a bit and then thread your needle, make sure they're lined up, and then we're going to start stitching. So we're going to start with the kind of traditional way of stitching, where you just catch your thread at the back. So you bring your needle in. Oh my goodness, what is on the back of my my desk is just covered in thread. The desk of a cross stitcher. So you pull it in, leave about an inch or so sticking out the back, and come back in. Now for stitching with this, I just remembered what the other 2 squares were on my example. You don't want to, I can never remember which one's which. One is the English way of stitching and one is the Danish way of stitching. But basically you don't want to stitch in half stitches and then come back on yourself, which I know is a very popular way of stitching. I don't always stitch that way. Sometimes I do. I hate starting like this though. So you're just catching your thread at the back. I use the loop method all the time, so starting like this is not my favourite, especially on camera. It's going to pull that through that loop so that it just catches at the back, and then that is not going anywhere, and you just catch it all the way along your row. So let me turn back over. So I am stitching 1 full cross stitch at a time. It doesn't matter which hole you start in, which hole you go to next, like none of that matters. It just matters that you are stitching one full cross stitch at a time, because again, if you're stitching in half stitches one way and then coming back over those stitches, you'll have, for example, green on the bottom and red on top, which again can make a really nice effect depending on what you're stitching, but most of the time you're going to want to do full cross stitches to really get the nice effect of the colour changing thread. So I mean, you can use 3 strands as well if you prefer to use 3 strands. If you're on 14 count either, that's fine as well. You can use as many strands as you need to, just as long as you're catching your thread at the back and doing full cross stitches as you're stitching along. Now well, it depends what you're stitching, but most of the time working in some form of row looks best, like going along the row and coming back on yourself, then along and back and along and back. I tend to recommend that, but it does depend on what you're stitching. So for example, very recently we were stitching a Halloween stitch along, well actually we're still stitching the haunted Halloween stitch along, and I've done like a moon in that picture, in that design, and the moon is stitched in 51. It's a variations thread, I think. I can never remember the difference between variations and variegated. I'm pretty sure it's variations though, but anyway, it's just all different oranges and yellows and things, and it was meant to be like a blood moon. So I always stitch the design first, and when I stitched my moon, I realised that when it was done in rows, it looked a bit stripy, like a too stripy, and looked kind of like a sunset rather than a blood moon. So what I recommended everybody do, and they did, and it looked amazing, is stitch in patches. So say we had like the circle like this, instead of stitching row by row by row by row by row, stitch a little bit over here and then a little patch up here and then a patch down here, and like just do it as random as you could. And I just kind of left it up to people to just, I didn't want to give too much direction because it wasn't meant to be perfect. And some of the effects were so good on the moon. I still haven't unpicked mine and redone mine yet, but I totally am going to, because they looked so good. So you can do that as well. You can kind of stitch in patches as well. I did that again recently on like a leaf. We were stitching an autumn leaf. We were using, I think it was Indian Summer Coloris thread. I can't remember the number off the top of my heart, but that's like green, red, like kind of similar to this actually, but like burgundy and like dark green and almost like a mustard colour. And for that I did the same again, like I stitched in patches instead of in rows. But then another example is like, oh, I did that wrong. Stitching white on white is the worst. Let me unpick that. Another example, I stitched a lampshade and a rug on a pattern in Coloris thread, and for that I did stitch in rows and it looked really good. I really liked the effect. And also it can depend on how long your row is. The longer the row, the more of the colour change you're going to get. So as long as you've got like quite a long row, you know, say like this row was only this long to where the green stopped, we'd have like a green row, then a white row, then a red row, and then a green row, and then a white row. So that might not be the effect you're going for. But there's so many different ways to play with these threads, and I just think they're a great way to let your creativity come out when you're stitching and just kind of, I've done it again, I've gone across 2 squares. And yeah, just like do whatever you feel you want to do with them. Something I love using them for are borders, like if you're bordering anything, because you can just do a nice simple, like, well, what I do usually is like cross stitch, leave one, cross stitch, leave one, cross stitch, leave one, cross stitch, leave one. just all the way around a design. And I did that recently, well, not so recently, but for Christmas last year, and I used this thread, this thread, to go all the way around the border. In fact, I think I did it in back stitching actually. However I did it, it just looked really good, because the border just changed colour all the way around without having to change your threads over. And I'm going to do that, like we just did the same again on a Hello Autumn stitch along I'm doing. We have a tiny border in the middle of the design, and we used the autumn one I was on about for the leaf with the burgundy and the maroon and the dark green, and we done a border for that in Coloris thread, and it looked really good because again the colour changes were happening without actually having to change your thread, which is what I love about these. Something else I stitched with this particular thread, this Christmas one, is a stocking. I stitched a Christmas stocking in this and I loved it so much, and I did just do it in rows and made it look a bit stripy-ish, so that's really good. Now one question you might have is like to do like horizontal rows or vertical rows. I tend to do them like this as I'm showing you, but you could, but on, in fact, maybe I did on my rug, I did like a rug that was rectangular like this. And for that one, I did just go up and down. But again, like it just depends on how you stitch, on what you want the effect to be. I've done both. I go along sometimes, I go up and down sometimes. It just all depends. But I just think the most important thing tends to be making sure you're stitching in full cross stitches and don't use the loop method to start, to really get the full effect of the colour changing thread. So I'm going to stop there because I always thought I'd get to red, but it's taking ages to get to red. But can you see already the colour changes that you're getting? I just love this thread so much. It adds so much extra to your design. And let's just go back to this example because I think I remembered now that, so this bottom one here, can you see like how there's 4 different colours in one stitch almost? So for this bottom one, I used the loop method to start, so I folded my strand in half and then I stitched in half stitches one way and then came back in half stitches the other way, and it just gave this almost like, I don't even know what effect to call that. Like I actually kind of love it, but also like it's so pretty. The colour changes up here as well. So if you want to go and look more into the different ways you can stitch and how to get these different effects, you can check them out on the blog. But I hope those tips helped you and just helped you figure out how to cross stitch with colour changing threads, and I'll speak to you really soon.